I remember the wind was sharp, cutting through the thin October sunlight as I stood beside the grave. The casket, holding my father, Marcus, looked small and cheap, a standard pine box that Mom and I had barely managed to afford after scraping together every last dime. It was exactly the kind of modest, forgettable funeral that my Aunt Deborah and Uncle Hank were determined to make even more miserable. "Look at poor Ava," my cousin Schuyler stage whispered, loud enough for half the small crowd of mourners to hear. Schuyler has always had a knack for cruelty disguised as commentary, still trying to act like she matters. "Did you see those shoes? Goodwill special, I bet." I kept my eyes locked on the casket, trying to hold on to the dignity my father, Marcus, had always radiated, even when his so-called modest life meant he was constantly the target of their snide remarks. He was an insurance agent, a respectable, if financially unremarkable, profession. To Deborah and Hank, who lived ostentatiously on credit card debt and generational arrogance, Marcus was just a neighborhood embarrassment. "He died a crook with nothing to his name," Uncle Hank announced, his voice booming across the cemetery lawn in Westchester, making sure the few remaining neighbors and the tired-looking priest heard every word. "Criminal families breed criminal children. Good thing he didn't leave her any debt." A wave of hot, miserable shame washed over me, but it was nothing new. This had been the dynamic for 25 years. Every family gathering, every holiday dinner, every moment Mom and Dad spent around her side of the family was an opportunity for them to tear us down. And through it all, Mom, Sharon, stood right next to me, silent, not defending Dad, not defending me, just staring straight ahead like a statue, prioritizing her relationship with her cruel, self-absorbed siblings over the dignity of her own husband and daughter. That silence hurt more than any word Hank or Deborah could utter. I felt the tears finally start to fall, not just for the loss of my dad, but for the profound unfairness of this moment, for the betrayal of my own mother's silence. It felt like they were burying us both. Then the engine started. It wasn't the slow, hesitant rumble of an approaching hearse or a late-arriving mourner. This was a synchronized, deep, throaty purr that only comes from expensive, heavy-duty machinery. 3 charcoal-black luxury SUVs, the kind with completely tinted windows, rolled through the gates of the cemetery. They moved with a military precision that immediately commanded the attention of every single person present, even forcing the wind to pause. 6 men in tailored suits emerged. They didn't look like mourners. They looked like something out of a geopolitical thriller, dangerous, expensive, and impeccably controlled. The lead man, silver-haired, radiating quiet authority, walked directly toward me, his eyes the color of gunmetal locked onto mine. He stopped, took my hand with a surprising gentleness, and then, in a gesture that belonged in a European royal court, he bowed deeply, his eyes never leaving mine. "Miss Ava," he said, his voice a low, melodic rumble that nonetheless cut through the silent cemetery air. "Victor Sterling, the Dawn has been waiting to meet you. Your father spoke of you every day." Aunt Deborah made a choking sound that sounded exactly like a crow being strangled. Uncle Hank's face went from pale to a disturbing shade of gray. My cousins Schuyler and Drew, who moments ago were snickering at my discount shoes, were frozen, their earlier mockery replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated fear. The cemetery had fallen, completely silent. The priest stopped his nervous packing and stared. They had spent my father's funeral calling him a nobody, mocking my grief, laughing at my shoes. They had absolutely no idea who they had actually been dealing with. Victor Sterling. I realized later that everyone in the city knew that name. It was one of the most powerful and whispered about names in the region. Still held my hand. Up close, I noticed the fine, silver threading through his dark hair, and the faint scar near his cheekbone that suggested he was a man who had faced and survived serious trouble. He had 5 other men standing behind him, motionless, their presence suggesting a controlled power that was one wrong move away from becoming threatening. One of them held an enormous floral arrangement, white roses and lilies, arranged in a cascade that looked fit for a state funeral, not this humble plot. He placed it carefully beside Dad's simple casket, and the flowers dwarfed everything else there, a silent, fragrant declaration. This man mattered. This man was powerful enough that his death demands respect. "I apologize for the interruption," Victor said, turning slightly to address the gathered mourners, his voice smooth and almost warm, yet carrying a subtle, chilling undertone. "But Miss Ava has matters to attend to. Her father's true family wishes to pay their respects." The emphasis on true family was a deliberate, sharp blow that struck Uncle Hank and Aunt Deborah, who suddenly looked small, insignificant, and utterly dismissed. "When you are ready, Miss Ava," Victor continued, his attention back on me, "the dawn is waiting. There are things you need to understand about your heritage, things your father kept separate to protect you." My heritage? The word felt alien. I looked at my mother one last time. Sharon was staring at Victor Sterling with an expression I'd never seen before, a terrifying mix of terror and instant recognition. Not surprise, but recognition. She knew exactly who these men were. She knew this was real. "Mom." I whispered, my voice sounding strained. She looked at me briefly, then quickly away, her eyes glistening with unshed tears, yet still choosing silence. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible, but in the crushing silence of the cemetery, every syllable carried. "Go with them, Ava," she choked out. "Your father, he would have wanted this." It was the final confirmation. My mother had known something all along. Enough to recognize the symbols of power and the name Victor Sterling. She knew Dad had secrets, connections, and a life far beyond the modest insurance agent facade. And yet, she had stood silent for 25 years while her family treated us like trash, choosing their validation over our dignity. The sting of that betrayal was immediate and blinding. I turned my back on the cruelty and the cowardice. "I'll come with you," I told Victor, my voice steady, feeling a cold, unfamiliar resolve settle in my heart. His expression softened, an almost imperceptible nod of approval, perhaps even respect. As I took his arm and moved toward the waiting black SUV, Aunt Deborah's voice rose behind us, shrill and panicky. "Sharon, what is happening? Who are these people? What was Antonio actually involved in?" I didn't look back. I couldn't. If I saw Mom's face again, I knew I would break, and I refused to give them the satisfaction of witnessing my final emotional collapse. Victor guided me with a careful courtesy, as if I were something precious and fragile. One of his men opened the door to the lead SUV, revealing an interior that was more luxurious than any vehicle I had ever even seen. Leather, polished wood, and an atmosphere of expensive, controlled power. It felt simultaneously safe and terrifying. The door closed with a satisfying, solid thunk, the sound of German engineering sealing us off from the world and the chaos we left behind. Through the tinted window, I saw my mother's family descending into a full-blown panic. Deborah grabbing Sharon's arm. Hank staring at the SUVs as if he'd just realized he was about to make the biggest mistake of his life, and Skylar and Drew frozen, their smug superiority utterly shattered. The SUV began to move, smooth and quiet, pulling away from the humble grave, the cheap casket, and the family that had just witnessed the complete, silent, seismic shift of my entire reality. I was still wearing the discount store shoes Schuyler had mocked, but something had irrevocably changed. I wasn't leaving as the poor, crying daughter of a crook. I was leaving as something else entirely. I just didn't know it yet. And that's where my real journey began. The drive was silent for a few moments, the only sound the quiet, controlled hum of the powerful engine. It was necessary, I realized, for me to gather myself, to let the shock of the past hour settle into something manageable. Victor Sterling, sitting across from me in the plush, black leather seat, was watching me with an intensity that wasn't invasive, but acutely aware. "I know you have 1,000 questions, Miss Ava," he said finally, his voice now lower, completely free of the performance he had delivered for the benefit of my mother's family. "And you deserve every answer. But first, you need to hear about your father." I sat stiffly, my hands clenched in my lap, feeling the cheap seams of the dress I was wearing, the same kind of affordable, respectable clothes my family always bought. "He was Marcus," I managed, the name feeling too small for the man who had just commanded this kind of respect in death. "He sold insurance. He loved me." Victor gave a slow, deliberate nod. "He did. He loved you more than anything he ever built, and that is saying a great deal. But he was Antonio Marcus Moretti. His mother, your grandmother, was the younger sister of Don Vito Moretti. Your father wasn't just connected to the Moretti family, he was family, blood. And in our world, Miss Ava, blood is everything." The name landed like a physical blow, Don Vito Moretti. The name was legendary in our state, a whispered myth of influence and shadow power. He was the figure who allegedly shaped everything. Major real estate deals, union contracts, and which politicians received anonymous support. Every news story about organized crime in the tri-state area mentioned that name. Every businessperson in high finance knew that certain large-scale decisions required, at minimum, his tacit approval. My father, the man whose simple life I had defended, who had quietly read the paper in his worn recliner, he was connected to that. "The insurance job was real," Victor continued, reading the confusion and disbelief in my face perfectly. "But it was a cover, a way to explain a comfortable lifestyle without drawing the kind of attention that would compromise the people he was truly working for. Your father was the Don's most trusted advisor for 25 years. He managed the family's legitimate business holdings, the Harbor Grill Group, Moretti Legacy Holdings, investments, acquisitions. He was the bridge between our world and the world you grew up in. I thought about the late-night phone calls Dad would take in the den, closing the door the moment he realized I was nearby, the meetings at our house that would instantly fall silent when I entered the room. The way certain well-dressed people would treat him with an odd mix of deference and fear when we were out in public. The life we lived, which felt comfortable despite his modest reported income, suddenly snapped into devastating, perfect focus. Every confusing piece of the puzzle clicked. "He kept you separate from all of this, Miss Ava," Victor said, his tone shifting from informative to gentle, yet firm. "Not because he was ashamed of you, and certainly not because he was ashamed of his family. He did it because he loved you. He wanted you to have choices he never had, a normal life, a future without the weight of obligation, unless you chose to accept it." I thought of the insults from Hank and Deborah, the years of quiet humiliation my father had endured to maintain that carefully constructed normal life for me. He was worth millions and had allowed himself to be called a crook with nothing, all to protect my normalcy. I had so many questions, but only one mattered in that moment. Where are we going now? To meet the Don, Victor replied, the simplicity of the statement carrying the full weight of its significance. Your great-uncle. He would have come to the funeral himself. But your father was very specific. He wanted your introduction to the family to happen privately, with dignity, not as a spectacle at a cemetery. The SUV was winding through a part of the city I immediately recognized. The historic district of North Harbor, where the old money resided, the kind of homes that had belonged to the same families for generations, requiring trust funds just to pay the property taxes. We pulled up to massive, wrought iron gates that opened silently, revealing a sprawling stone estate that looked like something out of a classic Hollywood movie about East Coast dynasties. Victor's demeanor shifted once more. He was no longer the dangerous enforcer, but a serious mentor. Before we go inside, he said, placing a reassuring, light hand on my arm, you need to understand this is your choice. The Don will explain your inheritance, your options, and your father's legacy. But nothing is required. You can walk away right now with your father's legitimate holdings and live whatever life you choose. Or you can learn. You can understand. You can take your place in the family your father came from. The gates closed behind us with an echoing click. Through the windshield, the main house loomed, enormous, elegant, radiating the kind of wealth that didn't need to announce itself. It simply was. My father had been from this place, connected to this power, and he had chosen to raise me away from it because he loved me enough to want me to have the freedom of choice. And my mother's family the entire time had been treating him like a failure. The cold resolve I'd felt earlier began to sharpen into something focused and strategic. They had called him a crook with nothing. They had mocked my shoes and my tears. They were about to learn that they had been playing checkers against a man who was quietly running a complex, multi-level chess match. And now I was ready to learn how to play too. The SUV stopped in front of the main house. Victor opened my door with the same courtly courtesy. I climbed the stone steps on legs that were shaking, still wearing the discount shoes, preparing to face the dawn. The man standing at the top of the steps waiting for me was in his late 70s, impeccably tailored, with dark eyes that seemed to take in my entire life in a single, intense glance. This was Don Vito Moretti. This was the moment I stopped being Ava and became Antonio's daughter. "Ava!" Don Vito said, his voice carrying the deep resonance of a man accustomed to command, with a faint, old-world accent that hinted at the deep roots of the family. "Come inside, please." He didn't move like an old man. There was a coiled strength in his posture, a quiet authority in the way he stood. Victor fell back slightly, a clear sign of deference that immediately established the hierarchy. I ascended the steps and met Don Vito's gaze, his hand extended toward me as I reached the top landing. "I am Salvador Vito Moretti, your great-uncle," he said, his grip firm yet gentle. "I'm sorry it took your father's passing to bring you home." Home! The word felt utterly foreign applied to this museum-like estate. He led me through an entrance hall paved with marble floors, past paintings that looked both ancient and priceless. We walked through corridors where other men in suits stood, nodding respectfully as we passed, their expressions carefully neutral, silent guards in a fortress of power. Don Vito's study smelled of leather, old books, and a faint, particular scent I couldn't place, perhaps the quiet aroma of decisions that changed lives. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined two walls, and a massive mahogany desk dominated the center of the room. He gestured to one of the oversized leather chairs near a fireplace. "Please sit." I sank into the chair, gripping the armrests to stop my hands from trembling. Victor took a post near the door, a silent sentinel. Don Vito studied my face for a long moment before speaking. "You have your grandmother's eyes," he said quietly. "Maria, my younger sister, Antonio's mother. She passed when you were just a baby, but she would have loved the woman you've become. Antonio spoke of you constantly, your intelligence, your kindness, your spirit. He was profoundly proud." Something in my chest loosened at his words. This stranger, this legendary figure, was acknowledging my grief as real and important, not something pathetic to be mocked. "Losing your father," Don Vito continued, his voice catching slightly, "was like losing a son. Antonio was family in every sense that matters. His death diminishes us all." He stood and walked to his desk, returning with a thick folder bound in brown leather. My name, Ava Moretti, was written on the tab in careful, elegant handwriting. He placed it on the small table between us. "Your father was a meticulous man," the Don said, settling back into his chair. "He prepared for every possibility, including this day. These documents represent your inheritance." My hands shook as I reached for the folder and opened it. The first page was a property deed, the Harbor Grill Group, a name I vaguely recognized from popular, upmarket restaurants in the city. Listed underneath were 12 prime locations and financial statements showing revenue in the millions. Not just millions, but tens of millions. I flipped to the next document, Moretti Legacy Holdings. 37 residential and commercial buildings throughout the metro area, each listed with current, astonishing market valuations. Then came stock certificates, investment portfolios, and bank statements with balances that had so many zeros I had to count them twice, then again, just to believe what I was seeing. "Your father," Don Vito said quietly, watching my reaction intently, "was worth approximately $42 million when he passed. Every penny of it, legitimate and documented, now belongs to you." The room seemed to tilt slowly around me. $42 million. I had just spent the last 25 years living in a small, respectable house, wearing cheap clothes and enduring the slights of Aunt Deborah and Uncle Hank, who had called my father a crook with nothing. All the while he was a multimillionaire, an architect of a successful, legitimate empire. The irony was a crushing weight. "How?" I whispered, the question barely audible. "Your father was brilliant with money," the Don explained. "He started with one restaurant location, used the success to fund the next, then moved into real estate when the market was low. He invested wisely. He did it all legally with proper documentation, clean books, and legitimate business practices. The insurance cover was exactly that, a cover to keep attention away from the real, quiet business he was running." Victor spoke from the doorway. "But there is more than just the money, Miss Ava." Don Vito nodded, his expression turning grave as he reached for a second folder, thinner than the first, but somehow radiating a much heavier presence. "Your father also held certain responsibilities within our family organization," the Don said carefully. "He mediated disputes between business people who couldn't use traditional courts. He provided protection services for legitimate businesses facing illegal threats. He ensured that certain operations, some legal, some less so, ran efficiently and, most importantly, without unnecessary violence." He opened the second folder, revealing what looked like summarized case files. Mentions of restaurant owners being extorted, construction companies facing sabotage, small shop owners being threatened by loan sharks. "Antonio solved problems," Victor explained. "The kind of problems the police can't or won't handle. the kind that requires understanding both legitimate commerce and the less than legitimate world that operates alongside it. These responsibilities do not automatically transfer to you, Ava. You inherit the money regardless. You can walk away from all of this right now and live whatever life you choose. Your father made absolutely certain you'd have that choice. I stared at the two folders on the table, one representing legitimate wealth, the other representing a powerful shadow world. Don Vito stood again and pulled out a leather-bound photo album. Your grandmother, Maria, was my baby sister, he said, tracing her face in a photograph. She married your grandfather, who is not from our world, and our father was furious, but Maria loved him. Antonio grew up understanding both worlds, the legitimate one his father came from, and the family business his mother's side represented. He became the bridge. I saw photos of my dad, younger, laughing at family gatherings, looking confident and powerful in contexts I'd never witnessed. He separated you out of love, the Don reiterated gently. He wanted you to have the freedom he lacked. So, I ask you now, Ava, what do you want? Walk away with the money, and no one will judge you. Or stay, learn, and take your place in the legacy your father built for you. I thought about my mother's betrayal, my cousin's cruelty, and my father's quiet, 25-year endurance of their insults. A cold, focused rage that was not hot anger, but strategic calculation settled in my gut. I want to learn, I said, the words ringing with certainty. I want to understand what my father built. And I want certain people to understand exactly who they have been disrespecting. Don Vito smiled, a genuine warmth that softened his entire face. Then your education begins tomorrow, he said. Victor will be your guide, your teacher, your protection. But tonight you rest. Say goodbye to the girl you were, and prepare for the woman you're becoming. Victor stepped forward. I'll take you home, Miss Ava, unless you prefer to stay here tonight. I shook my head. I needed to be in my own space, in the home I'd shared with Dad, to process this cataclysmic truth. Don Vito embraced me, not a formal business hug, but the firm, genuine affection of family. Your father loved you more than anything in this world, he whispered. Everything he did, every choice he made, was to protect you and give you the future you deserved. Never doubt that. As Victor drove me back through the city, the urban landscape was transformed. The restaurants, the construction sites, the office towers, my entire life had been surrounded by my father's empire, and I hadn't known it. The discount store, shoes on my feet, suddenly felt different. Not shameful, but meaningless. I was the daughter of Antonio Marcus Moretti, the heir to a $42 million empire, and my mother's family had no idea what their cruelty at the funeral was about to cost them. Victor Sterling arrived at my small, familiar house the next morning at 7 on the dot. He wasn't in a suit this time, but in a perfectly tailored cashmere coat, carrying 2 paper cups of coffee and a leather portfolio that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment used to be. "Ready for your first day of school?" he asked, a slight smile playing on his lips as he handed me a coffee. It was exactly how I liked it, light cream, no sugar. That meant either he'd asked someone or he was the kind of person who paid attention to details most people missed. I suspected the latter. Our first stop was the corporate headquarters of the Harbor Grill Group, my father's legitimate restaurant empire. It was located in a quiet, recently gentrified neighborhood in a modest, professional office building. Nothing flashy, nothing that screamed organized crime or illegal enterprise, just a tasteful bronze plaque next to the entrance. The woman who met us in the lobby was Isabella Romano, a sharp, composed woman in her 40s. Her handshake was firm, her smile genuine, and she wore her professionalism like a second skin. "Miss Moretti," she said, and hearing my newly reclaimed last name spoken with respect instead of contempt felt strange but right. "I've been managing operations for your father for 12 years. She led us to a conference room where detailed financial reports were already laid out, organized by location and quarter. As she walked me through the numbers, the revenue streams, the profit and loss statements, the supplier contracts, I realized these were not just restaurants. They were meticulously orchestrated operations that provided hundreds of families with jobs, stability, and benefits. "Your father visited every location monthly," Isabella explained, pulling up employee rosters on her laptop. "He knew every manager, most of the servers, even the kitchen staff by name. People didn't work for Mr. Moretti because they were afraid of him. They worked for him because he treated them fairly, paid them well, and respected their time." She showed me payroll records, inventory management sheets, and expansion plans. Everything was documented, professionally managed, and entirely legitimate. The pride in her voice when she talked about Dad was unmistakable. It was genuine respect for a man who had built something valuable, something real. "He never missed a payroll," she said quietly, almost an aside. "Not even during the 2008 recession when half the independent restaurants in the city were closing. Your father took personal losses himself rather than lay anyone off. He made sure every single employee got paid on time, every time." I thought about Uncle Hank calling him a crook and Aunt Deborah implying his money came from dirty deals. These businesses were feeding families, providing health care, and creating opportunities. There was nothing dirty about that. There was only compassion backed by astute business sense. After the Harbor Grill Group, Victor took me to Moretti Legacy Holdings, my father's real estate portfolio. I met Daniel Foster, a man in his 50s with a pragmatic, no-nonsense demeanor, who managed the properties. "Your father had a simple philosophy about real estate," Daniel explained as we drove past several buildings in his portfolio. He bought buildings in neighborhoods that genuinely needed investment, renovated them properly, and charged fair rents. He wasn't running a charity, but his rent structures ensured working families could afford them while still allowing us enough margin to maintain the properties correctly and turn a reasonable profit. We stopped at a 3-story apartment complex that looked pristine, fresh paint, new windows, and a well-maintained courtyard. "This building was condemned when your father bought it 15 years ago," Daniel recounted. "Drug dealers were operating out of half the units. The landlord had abandoned it, and the city was planning to demolish it. Your father bought it, cleaned it out, renovated every unit, and turned it into quality, affordable housing. The families living here now, most of them have been here over a decade. That's stability. That's community impact. Dad hadn't been a slumlord extracting maximum profit. He'd been building something that lasted, something that demonstrably improved the quality of life in neighborhoods instead of exploiting them. He was a force for good, operating with quiet, patient diligence. Antonio was tough but fair," Daniel continued. "Tenants who paid on time and followed the rules? He'd work with them if they hit hard times, payment plans, temporary assistance. Tenants who caused problems or destroyed property, he didn't tolerate them. But he always gave people chances to do the right thing before consequences happened. Every single person I met that first week, from the restaurant managers to the property supervisors, treated Dad's memory with genuine affection and deep respect. The contrast with my mother's side of the family couldn't have been sharper. They had judged him based on surface-level appearances and their own greed. These people judged him based on 2 decades of competence, fairness, and unwavering loyalty. It was during this week of deep dives into the legitimate business side that I began to understand the core of my father's genius. He was a brilliant strategist, using his legitimate enterprises not just for wealth, but as a cover, a safety net, and a source of quiet power that fueled the family's true, complex operations. He had built me a foundation of rock-solid legitimacy, so that when the truth finally came out, no one could question the source of the wealth or the integrity of his legacy. And this was just the beginning. The next step would take me into the shadows he worked so hard to keep me out of. The learning curve was steep but invigorating. On the 4th day of my formal education, Victor took me to meet Elena Ricci, who managed what Victor cryptically called community relations. Her office was small, located above one of the Harbor Grill locations, and smelled faintly of espresso and the clean scent of organized paper. Elena herself was sharp-eyed, direct, and clearly a woman who didn't waste time on pleasantries. Your father handled the problems that traditional channels can't or won't solve, she explained, gesturing toward file cabinets that lined the wall. Disputes that need mediation. Situations that require creative solutions. Essentially, we are the emergency services for the community when the standard system breaks down. She pulled out a file at random and opened it on the desk. Inside were detailed notes about a restaurant owner being extorted by gang members who had decided his business should pay protection money. Police couldn't help, Elena said, her voice matter of fact. The victim was too scared to testify, and the gang had connections that made official intervention complicated. Antonio stepped in, she continued. He had a conversation with the gang's leadership. He explained that this particular business was now under Moretti protection and suggested they focus their activities elsewhere. Problems solved. Without violence. The owner is still in business today, and he pays a small, reasonable fee for the assurance that he will never face that threat again. She showed me case after case. A construction company facing sabotage from competitors who didn't like honest bidding. A small shop owner pressured by loan sharks charging illegal interest. A family business being targeted by developers who wanted the property and didn't care about legal acquisition methods. In each case, Dad had intervened, sometimes with negotiations, sometimes with calculated pressure applied to the right people. His methods existed in a carefully managed gray area between strictly legal and absolutely necessary. Your father prevented violence, Elena stated firmly. The neighborhoods mourned him because he kept people safe in ways the system couldn't or wouldn't. He wasn't a saint. This work requires getting your hands dirty sometimes. But he had principles. Protect the innocent, stop the bullies, and make sure ordinary people could live and work without being victimized. This was a far cry from the crude, criminal enterprise Aunt Deborah always implied. Yes, Dad operated outside the normal channels. And yes, some of his methods weren't strictly legal, but he was acting as a force of justice for people who had nowhere else to turn. He was a protector. On the 6th day, Victor drove me to Bennett Auto Repair, a small, clean shop in a neighborhood I recognized from my childhood. Marcus Bennett, the owner, came out, wiping his hands on a rag, his face etched with exhaustion and worry. "Miss Moretti," he said, shaking my hand with a grip that was firm despite his obvious stress. "I appreciate you taking the time. Your father helped me once before, about 10 years back. I was hoping you might have inherited his sense of fairness." We sat in his small office where he explained his situation. A larger, national auto chain had moved into the area and decided Marcus's independent shop was competition they didn't need. They started with predatory pricing, undercutting him until they bled money themselves, then moved to intimidation, vandalism, and anonymous complaints to city inspectors about violations that didn't exist. "I've lost half my customers in 3 months," Marcus said, his voice breaking slightly. "I have 5 employees who depend on me, families who need those paychecks. If this continues another month, I'll have to close. 20 years of building this business gone." Victor watched me carefully as Marcus talked. This was the test, I realized. My first real decision. My first chance to deploy the power I had inherited. I asked questions. Who owned the competing chain? What specific tactics were they using? Had Marcus tried legal channels? The answers painted a clear picture of systematic, corporate intimidation designed to destroy a small, honest competitor. The hot, aimless rage I'd felt at the funeral had cooled into something more strategic. "Give me 3 days," I told Marcus, meeting his worried gaze. "Don't make any decisions about closing. Just give me 3 days." Relief flooded his face, transforming his exhausted expression. "Thank you. I don't know what you can do, but thank you for trying." As we left, Victor's expression showed approval. "Your father would handle it exactly that way," he said. "Listen. Promise nothing specific, but give hope. Then deliver results." "How would he have handled it?" I asked. "By finding pressure points," Victor replied. "Everyone has vulnerabilities. The trick is finding them and applying pressure precisely where it matters most. Not displays, not threats, just quiet, effective action that makes people realize continuing their current behavior will cost them more than they're willing to pay." That evening, I drove to the small house Mom and I had shared with Dad. Sharon was in the living room, surrounded by boxes, packing up Dad's belongings, the remnants of a life she was finally admitting she didn't fully understand. She looked up when I entered, her face showing guilt and something else. Fear, perhaps, or uncertainty about where we stood now. "Ava," she said, standing awkwardly. "I wasn't sure you'd come back." I sat in Dad's worn recliner, the chair where he'd pretended his life was simple. "What did you know, Mom?" I asked directly, about Dad's real life, his family, his business. She sat back down heavily, her hands twisting in her lap. The silence stretched. "I knew he came from money," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "I knew he had connections, important connections. Antonio kept the details vague, and I learned not to ask questions." "Why?" "Because asking questions meant acknowledging things I didn't want to acknowledge," she said, her voice cracking. "Your father told me once, early in our marriage, that his family's business involved activities that existed in gray areas. He said the less I knew, the safer I'd be. And I chose not to know, even when your family treated him like garbage for 25 years. She flinched, the guilt evident. "I thought defending him would make things worse, that if I pushed back, my family would cut us off completely. And then where would we be?" "Where would you be?" I corrected, the words coming out sharper than I intended. "You were worried about losing their approval, not about Dad's dignity, not about protecting me from their cruelty." "I was scared," she whispered, defeated, "of being alone, of losing the only family I had left besides you and Antonio." "So you sacrificed us instead," I said, the truth hanging between us, raw and unyielding. "The men in the SUVs at the funeral, that was his family, wasn't it?" She nodded. "And they came for you. They came to tell me who I really am, and who Dad really was, what he built." The gulf between us had never felt wider. She had made her choices, silence, fear, choosing comfort over courage. Now I was making mine. "I'm going to learn," I said simply. Understand what Dad created. Take my place in the family he came from. Ava, that world is dangerous. You don't understand. It is my birthright, I interrupted, standing up, whether you like it or not. I left without promising to visit again soon. She didn't ask me to. 3 months passed in a blur of intense learning and strategic execution. 3 months of morning meetings with Victor Sterling, afternoons studying business operations at the Harbor Grill Group, and evenings reviewing case files about Dad's community work with Elena. 3 months of transformation from the girl who'd stood at her father's grave in discount shoes to someone who understood exactly what real power looked like. Precision backed by information. I had secured a restraining order and used targeted legal pressure on the national auto chain harassing Marcus Bennett, sending a clear, quiet message that certain independent businesses were now off limits. The auto chain retreated and Marcus Bennett was safe. I had delivered results. Then Skylar called. My phone rang on a Tuesday evening while I was reviewing complex property portfolios in the newly purchased, beautifully renovated townhome that now served as my residence, modest by Moretti standards, but light years beyond the small house I'd shared with Mom and Dad. The number that appeared was familiar. I hadn't heard from any of Mom's family since the funeral debacle. Ava, honey. Skylar's voice was dripping with an artificial sweetness that immediately raised every internal guard I'd learned to build over 3 months. I've been thinking about you so much. How are you doing? I let the silence stretch, just long enough to be uncomfortable. I'm well, Skylar. What can I do for you? Well, I know things were tense at Uncle Marcus's funeral, she stammered, using the word tense as if we'd had a minor disagreement, not a public shaming. But we're family, right? And I thought maybe we could reconnect, maybe have lunch sometime. The true motive finally broke through her facade. Actually, her false sweetness cracked. I heard you inherited some money from Uncle Marcus, and Drew and I are starting this boutique marketing agency. Really exciting opportunity, but we could really use an investor who believes in family supporting family. I almost laughed. The sheer, breathtaking audacity was a physical force. The same cousin who'd called us the pitiful family now wanted money from the inheritance she'd assumed didn't exist. How much are you looking for? I asked, keeping my voice calm and curious, a predator playing a long game. Well, to really launch properly, we'd need about $65,000 total. But even 30 or 40 would help us get started. And obviously, you'd see returns once we're profitable. This is a real investment opportunity, not just a handout. $65,000. To Skylar, that seemed like an enormous sum. She had no idea I could write that check without even checking my account balance. That's interesting, I said, feigning seriousness. Tell me about your business plan. She launched into a rambling, buzzword-laden pitch about social media, branding, and leveraging synergies. All the empty vocabulary people use when they don't actually understand business fundamentals. I let her talk, asking just enough technical questions to make her think I was seriously considering the investment. You know what? I cut her off when she finally ran out of rehearsed pitch. This sounds like something we should discuss properly. Why don't we talk about it at Christmas dinner? I'm hosting this year. The pause on the line was pregnant with calculation. Christmas dinner at your place? I have more space now, I said simply, allowing the understatement to hang in the air. And I think it's time for some new family traditions. I'll send invitations to everyone. You, Drew, your parents, my mother. We can discuss your business proposal then. Schuyler was clearly weighing whether to push for faster access to the money or accept the invitation that would put her in my space on my terms. Greed won. That's really generous of you, Ava, she said finally. Christmas dinner sounds perfect. I hung up and immediately called Victor Sterling. My cousin just asked me for $65,000 to start a marketing agency, I told him. I think we're ready to move forward with the Christmas revelation. How do you want to structure it? Victor's voice carried unmistakable approval. I want them all there, all the people who mocked Dad at his funeral. And I want documentation they can't dispute. Bank statements, property deeds, business licenses. Everything that proves exactly who Dad was and what he built. Consider it done, Victor replied. I'll have complete dossiers ready by next week. The dossiers arrived 5 days later in embossed leather portfolios. Victor spread them across the dining room table in my townhome, and we reviewed each one systematically. Uncle Hank first. His import business was hemorrhaging money. Poor inventory decisions, terrible vendor relationships, customers abandoning him for more reliable competitors. He was maybe 3 months from bankruptcy, but hiding it from everyone by taking cash advances on credit cards to cover basic operating expenses. He's been telling people business is great, Victor said, tapping financial statements that told a very different story. But the numbers don't lie. He's drowning in debt. Aunt Deborah's folder was even more revealing. Credit card debt approaching 6 figures. Purchases of designer clothes and expensive jewelry meant to maintain appearances, while minimum payments got missed. Her credit score had dropped over 100 points in the past year alone. She buys things to prove she's successful, I observed, studying the purchase histories. All performance. Schuyler and Drew's files showed similar desperation masked as ambition. Both had lost jobs in the past year. Schuyler from a marketing firm after missing deadlines repeatedly. Drew from a sales position after performance warnings he'd ignored. They were living off their parents while pretending to friends that they had decided to pursue entrepreneurship. The marketing agency Schuyler had pitched was nothing more than raw desperation wrapped up in a business plan. No actual clients, no concrete strategy. They've spent 25 years looking down on your family, Victor said quietly, while building lives that are one financial crisis away from complete collapse. The irony was almost poetic. They had mocked Dad as a poor crook while he sat on $42 million in legitimate assets. They'd called us pitiful while they were drowning in debt they couldn't acknowledge. I want to show them, I said, not destroy them. Just show them the truth they've been too arrogant to see. Victor nodded, a look of respect in his eyes. Your father would approve of that approach, Ava. He believed in lessons that lasted. I spent the next week meticulously preparing. The townhome, while elegant, wasn't the statement I needed, so I purchased a beautiful, historic estate in the Upper East Side. Not the largest house available, but impressive enough to raise eyebrows. The address alone would spark questions. The Christmas invitations went out on heavy cardstock with elegant script, formal but warm, deliberately vague about what announcements I'd be making. Just enough to ensure their curiosity and, more importantly, their attendance. Victor connected me with an event coordinator who understood exactly what kind of dinner I wanted. Comfortable, but clearly expensive. The catering was from the Harbor Grill Group's flagship location, the one Isabella told me had hosted senators and countless city officials over the years. The wines came from Dad's private collection, transferred to the new home's climate-controlled cellar. The table settings whispered elegance rather than shouting ostentation. The goal, I explained to the coordinator, is to create an atmosphere where they realize something's changed, but they can't quite identify what until we are ready to reveal it. We prepared presentation folders for each family member, carefully selected documents about Dad's business holdings, property deeds, financial statements, articles about community programs he'd quietly funded. Nothing classified or sensitive, just legitimate, irrefutable proof of who Antonio Marcus Moretti had truly been. Victor suggested bringing Don Vito to the dinner, arguing that his presence would make the power dynamic unmistakable. I shook my head. This first revelation needs to be about Dad's legacy, about showing them who they disrespected, not about intimidating them with family connections. That comes later if necessary. Your father would handle it exactly that way, Victor said approvingly. The night before Christmas dinner, I met with Don Vito in his study. He poured 2 glasses of amber whiskey, a vintage that probably cost more than my mother's previous monthly salary, a detail from my old life that felt increasingly distant. Tomorrow is a significant day, Ava, he observed, settling into the leather chair across from me. Tell me what you hope to accomplish. I considered the question honestly. Part of me wants to see them suffer the way they made Dad and me suffer for 25 years. He nodded slowly, no judgment in his expression. That's natural. They hurt you, and you want them to feel what that hurt was like. But I don't know if that's what Dad would want, I admitted. He spent his whole life being patient with them, dignified, taking their insults without striking back. I feel like using his legacy to crush them would be missing the point of his sacrifice. Don Vito took a sip of his whiskey, studying me with those dark, perceptive eyes. Let me tell you a story about revenge, he said finally. When I was a young man, a man humiliated my father in public. I wanted to hurt him, wanted him to pay in blood for disrespecting my family. He paused, the memory clearly sharp decades later. My father sat me down and explained something I've never forgotten. He said, revenge should never be about destruction. It should be about balance. It should be about teaching lessons that create understanding, rather than just causing pain. What did you do? I asked, leaning forward, utterly absorbed. I showed the man the truth about himself, Don Vito replied. I revealed his own weaknesses and failures in ways he couldn't ignore or deny. I made him understand exactly what he'd done and why it was wrong. That lesson lasted far longer than any physical punishment would have. He leaned forward slightly, his gaze intense. You have the power now to destroy your mother's family financially. I could make a few calls, and by New Year's their credit would be ruined, Hank's business foreclosed. Deborah would lose everything. It would be easy. But is that what your father would have wanted? The question hit me hard. Antonio spent 25 years showing them quiet dignity in the face of cruelty. He taught you patience and strategy through his example. Would he want you to use his legacy to become the kind of person who destroys families? I thought about Dad reading the newspaper in his worn recliner, the calm responses he always gave, never stooping to their level. I want them to understand who they disrespected, I said slowly, to acknowledge their mistake, to see the truth about themselves and about Dad. But I don't want to become the cruel person they were. Don Vito smiled, a genuine warmth that transformed his typically stern expression. You're more like your father than you know, Ava. Antonio would be very proud of the woman you're becoming. Tomorrow you show them the truth. You give them the chance to recognize their mistakes and choose how to respond. That's justice, Ava. Real justice, not revenge disguised as righteousness. I clinked my glass against his, feeling some of the hot, bitter anger that had been building for 3 months shift into something cold, focused and powerful. Tomorrow, my mother's family would learn exactly who Antonio Marcus Moretti had been. They'd see the empire they'd mocked, recognize the catastrophic error in judgment they'd made at his funeral, and then I would give them a choice about what to do with that knowledge, just like Dad would have done. Christmas Eve arrived with a crisp, cold air that felt appropriate for the dramatic reveal I had planned. I stood at the large bay window of my new estate, watching the street. Nerves and a keen sense of anticipation mixed in equal measure. This wasn't just a holiday dinner. This was the moment everything changed. Uncle Hank's aging sedan pulled through the iron gates at exactly 5:45 p.m., 15 minutes early. They'd clearly spent the drive speculating wildly about where I'd suddenly acquired the money for a house in this neighborhood, probably rehearsing probing questions disguised as concerned small talk. I watched them emerge. Aunt Deborah, first, wearing what was likely supposed to be a designer outfit, but looked like an expensive knockoff even from a distance. Her head swiveled, taking in the property, her expression cycling through confusion, calculation, and naked envy. Uncle Hank stepped out more slowly, his eyes already assessing and measuring, trying to estimate the cost of everything. Skylar and Drew emerged from the back seat, exchanging looks that I instantly recognized. Resentment mixed with greed. The look of people who realize someone they've looked down on might suddenly have something they desperately want. Mom, Sharon, was last, trailing behind them all, her body language screaming discomfort. She knew enough to be worried, even if she didn't know exactly what I had planned. I opened the door myself before they reached it. The event coordinator had suggested having staff answer, but I wanted this moment to feel personal. This wasn't about displaying wealth. This was about showing them truth. Ava. Aunt Deborah's voice was overly bright, artificial warmth that didn't reach her eyes. This house is, my goodness, how on earth did you afford this place? The question was an accusation disguised as curiosity. She wanted me to admit I'd gotten the money from somewhere questionable, something that would confirm their long-held, comfortable beliefs about Dad's shady past. Dad left me well provided for, I said simply, stepping aside to let them enter. The marble floors, the crystal chandelier, the furniture that whispered old money rather than shouting new wealth. The foyer did the talking I didn't need to do. Uncle Hank's eyes catalogued everything with barely concealed envy. This is quite the upgrade from that little house you shared with Antonio, he observed, and somehow he still managed to make it sound like an insult. Different circumstances, I replied neutrally. Let me take your coats. Skylar and Drew hadn't said a word yet, but I could see them reassessing everything they thought they knew about me. The cousin they'd mocked at the funeral was suddenly living in an estate that probably cost more than they'd earn in their lifetimes. I led them to the dining room, where the table was set with china and crystal from Dad's personal collection. Pieces Isabella had told me he had acquired over years, each one chosen carefully. The wine glasses alone probably cost more than Uncle Hank's monthly car payment. Mom's eyes darted around nervously, like she was waiting for a bomb to drop. She knew enough to be terrified, even if she didn't know the exact detonation time. Dinner started with uncomfortable small talk. The catering staff, trained professionals from the Harbor Grill Group's flagship location, served appetizers while my mother's family made careful conversation that scrupulously avoided acknowledging the obvious questions hanging in the air. By the main course, a beautifully prepared roast that Hank was clearly enjoying a little too much, Uncle Hank's patience wore thin. "So, Ava," he said, setting down his fork with deliberate emphasis, "we should probably discuss your situation." The word situation came out like I was a problem that needed managing. My situation? I asked calmly. This house? The sudden wealth? Or the family issues we left unresolved at the cemetery? Aunt Deborah nodded in agreement. Especially given your father's complicated business dealings. We just want to make sure you're not getting involved in anything questionable. The irony was exquisite. They were sitting in my house, eating my food, drinking my wine, and still managing to imply I was doing something wrong. Dad left me several things to manage, I said, keeping my voice level. I've spent the past 3 months learning about his business interests. Aunt Deborah's laugh was sharp and disbelieving. Business interests? Antonio sold insurance, Ava. He barely scraped by. Whatever money you think you have. Let me show you something, I interrupted, standing and retrieving the presentation folders Victor and I had prepared. I placed one in front of each person at the table, my mother included. What's this? Uncle Hank asked suspiciously. Information about Dad that you might not have known, I said, returning to my seat and opening my own folder. I thought it was time you understood who Antonio Marcus Moretti actually was. I started with the Harbor Grill Group. I walked them through the business licenses, the property deeds, the financial statements showing 12 locations and annual revenue in the millions. I showed them employee rosters, tax returns, and articles about the company's role in neighborhood revitalization. This is fake, Uncle Hank sputtered, but his voice lacked conviction. Antonio worked in insurance. I slid notarized documents across the table. Business licenses with official seals, property deeds recorded with the city, tax returns filed with the federal government. Every piece of paper was legitimate, verifiable, and irrefutable. Schuyler's face had gone pale. Drew's nervous laugh sounded forced. Aunt Deborah was staring at the documents as if they might spontaneously combust. I continued methodically through Moretti Legacy Holdings. 37 commercial and residential buildings, current market valuations, tenant agreements, photos of renovated properties that had transformed neighborhoods. Then the investment portfolios, stock certificates, diversified assets managed by registered financial advisors, with documentation spanning 2 decades. I don't understand, Mom whispered, staring at the numbers, and for a terrifying second, I almost believed she was seeing the full scope of the empire for the very first time. Dad built an empire, I said simply. A legitimate business empire that employed hundreds of people and improved thousands of lives. He just chose to live quietly and keep it private. Aunt Deborah's voice went shrill. Why would he hide all this money if he actually had it? Why live in that tiny house and let Sharon work if he was worth $42 million, I finished for her. That's what Dad was worth when he died, and every legitimate penny of it came to me. The number landed like a physical blow. Schuyler actually gasped. Drew's fork clattered onto his plate. Uncle Hank's face went through several colors before settling on a grayish white. Aunt Deborah's expression cycled through shock, disbelief, rage, and finally, something that looked like dawning horror as she processed what this meant, what she had said at the funeral about a man worth $42 million. That's not possible, Uncle Hank said weakly. We would have known. Your mother would have told us. Mom knew Dad had money, I said, looking at Sharon directly. She stared at her plate, saying nothing, choosing silence again, just like at the funeral. She just chose not to share that information with you. Isn't that right, Mom? Another agonizing nod. I own property throughout the city now, I continued, my voice calm and factual. I employ hundreds of people. I manage community programs that have helped thousands of families. Everything you thought you knew about Dad and me was wrong. The silence around the table was deafening. Then Skylar, desperately, tried to salvage her investment pitch. Ava, I know this is a lot of information, but about the marketing agency Drew, and I want to start. Why should I invest $65,000 in a business run by someone who mocked my shoes at my father's funeral? The question hung in the air like a cloud of smoke. Skylar's face flushed deep red. I didn't mean anything by that, she stammered. I was upset. People say things when they're upset. You called us the pitiful family, I said quietly. You and Drew whispered about how Dad died a crook with nothing. You mocked my tears while his body waited to be buried. I pulled out the second folder, the one with Victor's detailed research. Since we're talking about business investments, let me share some information about your financial situations. Uncle Hank's business was failing, hemorrhaging money from poor decisions, 3 months from bankruptcy, but hiding it from everyone. Aunt Deborah's credit card debt was approaching 6 figures, all designer purchases to maintain appearances while she drowned in minimum payments. Skylar and Drew were both unemployed for nearly a year, living off their parents while pretending to be successful young professionals. The marketing agency was desperation masked as entrepreneurship. I didn't need to be cruel. The numbers spoke for themselves. You spent 25 years calling us poor, I said, my voice leveled, calling Dad a crook with nothing, treating us like charity cases who didn't know our place. And the entire time, you were building lives that are one financial crisis away from complete collapse. I let that sink in. You mocked a man worth $42 million as someone who died with nothing. You insulted his daughter's shoes and tears at his funeral. And now you want that same daughter to solve your financial problems with the inheritance you claimed didn't exist. Aunt Deborah started crying, not tears of remorse, but tears of pure rage and humiliation. Where did you get our financial information? Uncle Hank demanded, his voice shaking with anger and fear. That's private. You had no right. Successful people have resources, I said simply. Dad taught me that, among other things. Uncle Hank shoved back from the table, his face purple with fury. This is outrageous. You invite us here under false pretenses, humiliate us with accusations. I invited you here to share information about Dad's legacy. I corrected. You're the ones who spent dinner implying I was involved in something questionable. You're the ones who called him a crook at his funeral. I'm just showing you the truth you were too arrogant to see. Aunt Deborah stood abruptly, grabbing her purse. We're leaving, Hank. Get the car. Skylar, Drew. We're going. They fled the room as if the house was on fire, their footsteps echoing through the foyer. The front door slammed hard enough to rattle the crystal chandelier. Mom sat at the table, staring at her untouched dessert, silent tears sliding down her face. You knew, I said quietly, the exhaustion of the night finally catching up to me. All along you knew. She nodded without looking up. And you let them treat us like garbage anyway. Another nod. Still no words. Still choosing silence over courage. I stood, utterly drained. You can stay if you want, I told her. The guest room is upstairs, second door on the left. Or you can leave. Your choice. I walked away, leaving her alone in the dining room with the ruins of the Christmas dinner and the immense weight of 25 years of cowardice. I found Mom still sitting at the dining table an hour later, staring into her wine glass as if searching for answers she was afraid to ask. The caterers had quietly packed up and left, leaving us alone in the cavernous, silent house. I poured myself a glass of water and sat across from her. The silence this time was heavier than the one at the funeral, stretched thin by the weight of too many unspoken truths. "I knew," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "About the money, about his family connections. Not everything, but enough." She needed to speak without prompting, so I remained silent. "When Antonio and I got married, he told me his family was complicated," she continued, her hands twisting in her lap. "That they had business interests that existed in gray areas, and the less I knew, the safer I'd be. He made me promise never to tell my side of the family, because he didn't trust them. He said they'd either try to use the information against us or accidentally expose things that needed to stay private." "So you knew he had money," I said quietly. "You knew he came from power, and you still let them treat us like charity cases for 25 years. "I thought defending him would make things worse," she repeated, tears starting to flow again. "I thought if I pushed back, if I acknowledged what I knew, my family would cut us off completely. And then where would we be?" "Where would you be?" I insisted, needing her to face the true source of her fear. She flinched, but didn't deny it. I was scared of being alone, of losing the only family I had left besides you and Antonio. I kept telling myself that their opinions didn't matter, that as long as we knew the truth, what they thought was irrelevant. "But it did matter," I countered, "because their cruelty hurt Dad. It hurt me. And you chose to let that happen rather than risk your relationship with people who didn't even respect you." I know, her voice cracked. The funeral was the worst. Hearing Hank call Antonio a crook, hearing Skylar mock you, knowing I should say something, but being too terrified to speak up. I kept thinking about what would happen if I defended him. Deborah would ask questions. I'd have to lie or tell truths I'd promised never to tell, and everything would get worse. I studied her face, the woman who'd raised me, who'd taught me to drive, who'd also stood silent while her family eroded our dignity piece by piece. "What happens now?" she asked, looking up at me with red-rimmed eyes. "Can you forgive me?" I wanted to say yes, to tell her everything would be okay, but the gulf was too wide. "I don't know," I said honestly. "Your silence hurt almost as much as their cruelty. Maybe more, because you were supposed to be on our side. You were supposed to protect us." "I was trying to protect you," she protested weakly. "If they'd known about Antonio's real family, if they'd started asking questions, talking to the wrong people." "Dad protected me just fine without your help," I interrupted. "He built an empire while keeping me completely safe. You weren't protecting me by staying silent. You were protecting yourself from having to make hard choices." She had no response to that. After another long silence, she stood. "I should go. I don't think I should stay here tonight." I didn't try to stop her. I walked her to the door and watched her drive away, still trapped in the same silence she'd maintained for 25 years. The call from Victor Sterling came the next morning, as I was still processing the emotional wreckage of Christmas dinner. "We have a problem," he said without preamble. "Your Uncle Hank has been asking questions, loud questions, about the Moretti family." I set down my coffee cup carefully. "What kind of questions?" "The kind that get back to people who matter," Victor replied, his voice tense. "He's been talking to neighbors, business associates, anyone who will listen, about whether Antonio was connected to organized crime and whether you're now involved with the Moretti organization." My stomach dropped. "How bad is it?" "Bad enough that the Don wants to meet with you this morning. Hank is making himself a liability, Ava. And when people become liabilities, decisions have to be made about how to handle them. The implication was clear. I'd wanted to teach my family a lesson, but in doing so, I might have just put Uncle Hank in actual, serious danger. "I'll be there in an hour," I said. The game had just gotten very real. Don Vito's expression when I entered his study wasn't angry. If anything, he looked almost pleased, like a teacher watching a student encounter a challenging new problem. "Sit," he said, gesturing to the familiar leather chair. "We need to discuss your uncle's sudden interest in family history." Victor confirmed the details. "He's telling anyone who will listen that his niece is connected to the Moretti organization, and he wants to understand what that means. Several people have asked me whether we have a problem that needs handling." The words "needs handling" made my mouth go dry. "I don't want him hurt," I said quickly. "He's ignorant and cruel, but he's still family." "That's the right instinct," Don Vito said, nodding approval. "But let me ask you a different question. What would you do if Hank's questions put you in danger, or your mother? What if his indiscretion exposed family business to authorities who'd love an excuse to investigate Moretti operations?" I hadn't thought that far ahead. I'd been so focused on showing them the truth about Dad that I hadn't considered the full, catastrophic consequences of revealing my own connections to the family. "Actions have consequences beyond what we intend," the Don continued, his voice patient but firm. "Having power means taking responsibility for what that power sets in motion. You wanted your family to understand who they'd been disrespecting. Now they know, and now they're reacting in ways that create new problems, requiring new solutions." He poured 2 small glasses of the amber whiskey. "You have 3 options," he said. 1. Victor visits Hank with a clear warning that further questions will have serious consequences. This is effective, but it creates fear and resentment. People who are frightened sometimes do unpredictable things. I nodded, following his reasoning. 2. We provide Hank with controlled information that satisfies his curiosity but contains nothing actually damaging. Give him enough truth to stop him digging, but carefully controlled truth. This requires trust that he'll accept what we tell him and stop asking questions. And the 3rd option, give him what he wants, Don Vito said simply. His business is failing. He needs money. We provide a loan, substantial enough to solve his immediate problems, with terms generous enough that he feels grateful rather than trapped. In exchange, he stops asking questions about family matters that don't concern him. He studied my reaction carefully. Your father would have chosen option 3. Antonio believed in solving problems by creating obligations and relationships rather than enemies and fear. Turn a potential threat into someone who owes you favors. It's more expensive in the short term, but more effective long term. Before I could respond, my phone rang. An unknown number, but something compelled me to answer. "Ava, it's your Aunt Jenna." I hadn't heard that voice in years. Jenna, Mom's youngest sister, had moved out to the Pacific Northwest after marrying young and had mostly disconnected from the family drama. "Aunt Jenna," I stepped out of the Don's study into the hallway. "Is everything okay?" "I just got off the phone with Deborah," she said, her voice tight with anger. "She called ranting about your Christmas dinner, about how you humiliated them with lies about Antonio's wealth. She wanted me to back her up, to agree that you were being cruel and inappropriate." "What did you tell her?" Jenna's laugh was sharp and brittle. "I told her she was an idiot who finally got what she deserved. But I wanted to hear your side directly, Ava. What actually happened?" I gave her the condensed version. The funeral, my education into Dad's real life, the Christmas revelation about his legitimate wealth, and the full scope of his legacy. Good, Jenna said when I finished. Deborah and Hank treated Antonio like garbage for years. I always thought it was cruel and unfair. I never said anything, because saying something would have meant getting dragged into family drama I wanted no part of. She paused, and her tone shifted, becoming serious. But there's something you should know. Something I never told anyone, because Antonio asked me to keep it private. I waited, feeling the importance of her next words. When my husband left me 12 years ago, I was broke and desperate. 2 kids, no job, no savings. I called Antonio because I didn't know where else to turn. Her voice softened with memory. He sent me $15,000. He said it was a gift, not a loan. He told me family was supposed to help family without keeping score. That money got me through the worst 6 months of my life. I hadn't known. Dad had never mentioned it. He made me promise not to tell Deborah or Hank, Jenna continued. Said they wouldn't understand, that they'd either judge me for needing help or judge him for giving it. So I kept it private. But I never forgot that your father saved me when my own sister wouldn't have lifted a finger to help. Thank you for telling me, I said quietly. It was a core piece of Dad's character I was just beginning to grasp. His quiet, strategic generosity. There's more, Jenna said, her tone shifting back to business. Deborah is talking about challenging Antonio's will. She's claiming he must have acquired his wealth through illegal means, and therefore it should be redistributed to legitimate family members. She's looking for lawyers who will take the case. My hand tightened on the phone. On what grounds? Greed disguised as moral outrage, Jenna said bluntly. She thinks if she can prove the money came from criminal activity, a court might redistribute the estate. It's nonsense. She has no evidence, no standing, nothing but spite and jealousy. But she's angry enough to try. If it comes to legal challenges, Ava, I want you to know I'll testify about Antonio's character and generosity. I'll tell any court that asks that your father was a good man who helped people without expecting anything in return. Deborah doesn't get to rewrite history just because she's embarrassed about being wrong. After we hung up, I stood in the hallway, processing everything. Uncle Hank asking dangerous questions, Aunt Deborah planning legal challenges, Mom's hollow apologies, and Jenna, an unexpected, powerful ally who truly understood who Dad had been. I returned to Don Vito's study. He was waiting patiently, his whiskey untouched, having clearly heard the one-sided conversation. My aunt is planning to challenge Dad's will, I told him. Claims the money must be illegal. It's not, Don Vito said calmly. Every penny Antonio left you came through legitimate business operations, with documentation that would survive any legal scrutiny. Let her waste money on lawyers. They'll tell her she has no case. And Uncle Hank? I asked. That's still your decision, Ava. But now you understand the full picture. Your family isn't just asking questions. They're actively trying to undermine what your father built. How you respond will define who you become. I thought about Dad's patience, his strategic thinking, his belief in turning enemies into obligations. I thought about the core of his decency that Jenna had just revealed. Option 3, I said finally. Give Hank the loan. Create an obligation instead of an enemy. Don Vito smiled, a rare, genuine expression. Your father would be proud. Victor arranged the meeting for the following afternoon at Bennett Auto Repair. The location was deliberate, neutral ground that also served as a quiet reminder of exactly what kind of work the Moretti family did, and who benefited from it. Marcus Bennett, the owner I had helped, personally called Uncle Hank. He said he'd heard Hank had questions about Antonio Moretti and the family and maybe they could talk privately. Hank, thinking he'd found someone willing to gossip and confirm his paranoia, agreed immediately. I arrived an hour early with Victor. Marcus Bennett greeted us, looking nervous but determined. "Your father helped me when I had nowhere else to turn," he said quietly. "If I can return that favor by helping his daughter handle a problem, that's the least I can do." When Hank's sedan pulled into the lot, I was sitting in Marcus's small, cluttered office, with Victor standing near the door. Marcus went out to meet him, all friendly handshakes and small talk, leading him inside before Hank realized what was happening. Hank stopped cold when he saw me. "What is this?" he demanded, his face flushing red. "Marcus, you said you wanted to talk." "I do want to talk," Marcus interrupted, stepping forward, "about why you've been asking questions that are making good people nervous." Hank's eyes darted between me, Victor, and Marcus, calculation visible in his expression. "I don't know what you're talking about. I have every right to ask questions about my brother-in-law's business dealings, especially when my niece suddenly appears with unexplained wealth and connections, too." "You have rights," I interrupted, my voice flat, "but rights come with responsibilities. One of those responsibilities is understanding that your loud questions are endangering people, including your own sister, Mom." That got his attention. "Sharon, what does she have to do with anything?" "You think broadcasting curiosity about the Moretti family is consequence-free," I said flatly. "You think asking strangers in public places about organized crime connections is just innocent inquiry. You're painting a target on everyone connected to me, including Mom, by confirming connections to the family." Marcus stepped forward. "Your brother-in-law helped me save my business 10 years ago," he said, "when larger competitors tried to destroy me through intimidation. Antonio intervened. He made sure I could keep my shop open, keep my employees working, keep supporting their families. Everything you see here exists because Antonio Moretti believed honest business people deserved protection from bullies." "And your questions," Victor added quietly, "are making people wonder if we have a problem that needs handling. Do you understand what I'm saying, Hank?" Hank's face had gone pale. He was finally grasping that this wasn't abstract gossip. This was real, tangible danger he'd stumbled into through arrogance and stupidity. "What do you want from me?" he asked, his voice small, defeated. I leaned forward. "I'm going to make you an offer. Just once. Pay attention because I won't repeat it." He nodded mutely. "Your business is failing," I said. "Not because of bad luck, but because you make poor decisions and treat people badly. Money alone won't fix that. But I'm willing to provide a one-time cash infusion of $50,000 to stabilize your immediate problems." His eyes widened with desperate hope. "I'll also introduce you to business consultants who actually know what they're doing, people who can help you restructure your operations properly if you're willing to listen and follow their advice." "Thank you," he started, but I held up my hand. "I'm not finished. In exchange, you stop asking questions about Dad and the Moretti family completely. You treat my mother with basic decency, and you acknowledge publicly that you misjudged my father." His expression shifted, hope warring with pride. "Publicly? What does that mean?" "It means calling the relatives who heard you mock Dad at his funeral and telling them the truth. That Antonio Marcus Moretti was a successful businessman who built a significant legacy, and you were wrong to disrespect him. The apology would cost him more than the money." I could see that calculation playing across his face. "If you accept," I continued, "we move forward with a clear understanding that this is the only help you'll ever receive from me. If you refuse, you handle your bankruptcy alone, and you explain to Aunt Deborah and your kids why you turned down help that could have saved them." Hank sat in the worn chair, his hands gripping the armrests, pride fighting desperation. "How do I know you'll actually give me the money?" he asked finally. "That this isn't just some trick?" Victor pulled an envelope from his jacket and placed it on the desk. "Bank check, 50,000, written out to Hank Harper's business account. Sign the agreement, make the calls, and it's yours today." Hank stared at the envelope. "What happens if I say no?" "Then you leave," I said simply, "and we never have this conversation again, and you figure out bankruptcy on your own while wondering what would have happened if you'd chosen differently." The silence stretched. He was trying to find an angle, a way to get the money without paying the price I was demanding. "The calls," he said finally. "What exactly do I have to say?" "The truth, that you misjudged Antonio Moretti, that he was a successful businessman who built legitimate enterprises, that you were wrong to disrespect him at his funeral, and you regret your words. Start with Aunt Jenna, then whoever else heard you call Dad a crook with nothing. We'll do it right now on speaker, so there's no confusion about whether you kept your end of the agreement." He looked at Victor, who remained expressionless. He looked at Marcus, who just shrugged. He looked at me and saw no mercy, no flexibility, just the deal on the table and the clock ticking. "Fine," he said finally. "I accept." I handed him my phone with Jenna's number already pulled up. "Make the call." His hand shook slightly as he dialed. When Jenna answered, I put it on speaker. "Hank," she sounded surprised. "Jenna," he cleared his throat. "I need to tell you something about Antonio, about what I said at his funeral." We waited. "I was wrong," Hank said, the words coming out stiff but clear. "Antonio Moretti was a successful businessman who built legitimate enterprises and contributed to his community. I misjudged him completely. I disrespected him at his funeral, and I regret my words." The silence on the other end of the line was loaded. Then Jenna laughed, a surprised, genuine sound. "Well, I didn't expect that. What changed your mind, Hank?" "I learned more about what he actually built," Hank said, which wasn't exactly a lie. "And I realized I'd been unfair to him and to Ava. So I'm apologizing publicly to anyone who will listen." After he hung up, I had him call 2 more relatives who'd been at the funeral. Each time, the apology came out smoother, more practiced, but still fundamentally honest. When the last call ended, Victor slid the envelope across the desk. "The consultants will contact you Monday morning," I said. "Listen to them. Follow their advice. And Hank, if I hear you've been asking questions about the family again, this arrangement ends permanently." He grabbed the envelope and left without another word, walking to his car like a man who'd just survived something dangerous, without fully understanding how close he'd come to disaster. 2 days later, a letter arrived from a law firm I didn't recognize. The letterhead was expensive, the language formal and threatening. "On behalf of our client, Deborah Harper, we are writing to formally challenge the validity of Antonio Moretti's will and the legitimacy of his estate." I read through the accusations. Claims that Dad's wealth must have been acquired illegally, demands for detailed accounting of every asset, threats to involve federal authorities if I didn't comply within 30 days. I called Patricia Williams, Dad's estate attorney, and read her the letter over the phone. She actually laughed. "Ava, this is the most toothless legal threat I've seen in months," she said. "Every asset Antonio left you came with documentation that would survive any scrutiny. We have decades of tax returns, business licenses, property records, all completely legitimate. So Deborah doesn't have a case?" She doesn't even have standing to bring one, Patricia said. She's not a beneficiary, not a spouse, not someone with any legal claim to the estate. Her lawyer is either incompetent or knows this is frivolous, but took her money anyway. Relief washed over me, but Patricia's tone shifted. However, Deborah's public accusation of illegality could invite attention from authorities who'd love an excuse to investigate the Moretti family. We need to respond with overwhelming documentation that proves legitimacy while making it clear that false accusations carry consequences. With your permission, I'll prepare a response that buries her lawyer in evidence, and I'll include language that makes clear continued harassment would be inadvisable. Do it, I said. That evening, my doorbell rang. Skylar stood on my front step. Mascara streaked down her face, looking more vulnerable than I'd ever seen her. Can we talk? She asked. Please, just the two of us. I almost closed the door. I almost said no, but something in her expression, raw pain instead of her usual calculated performance, made me step aside. We sat in my living room, the same room where I'd hosted the Christmas dinner that changed everything. She stared at her hands, twisting them in her lap, clearly struggling to find words. I've been jealous of you since we were kids, she said finally. Not of what you had, but of how you had it. Your dad loved you, really loved you. He knew who you were. My dad, she laughed bitterly. He sees me as a reflection of himself. If I succeed, it proves he's successful. If I fail, it embarrasses him. He doesn't actually know me at all. I'd never heard Skylar talk like this. Honest, vulnerable, without her usual armor of superiority. At the funeral, when I mocked your tears, your grief, she looked up, meeting my eyes. Part of me was angry because I knew I'd never have that kind of loss, because I've never had that kind of love. And that made me cruel in ways I'm ashamed of now. What changed? I asked gently. My parents told me I'm being disloyal by not supporting Mom's legal challenge against you, she said. That a good daughter would stand with family, regardless of whether they're right or wrong. And I realized they don't actually care about me. They care about my usefulness, my compliance. She wiped at her tears. I'm not asking for money or favors. I just wanted to apologize. Actually apologize. For the first time in my life, without any agenda behind it. I studied her face, looking for the calculation, the performance. But all I saw was exhaustion and honesty. If you're serious about starting over, I said slowly, building something real instead of just pretending. I know people who could help you find legitimate work, but it would mean earning your success instead of having it given to you. Skylar nodded. I understand, and I know I don't deserve your help after how I treated you, but if you're willing to give me a chance, I'll prove I'm serious about changing. For the first time, I saw a flicker of hope for redemption, even for people who had spent years being cruel. 6 weeks passed in a blur of business meetings and legal responses. Then Don Vito called with an invitation. I'm hosting an event, he said, to honor your father's contributions to the community, scholarships he funded, businesses he helped establish, families he assisted during hard times. It should have happened years ago, but Antonio preferred working quietly. Now, it's time people understood what he built. The event was held at the Harbor Grill Group's flagship restaurant on a Saturday afternoon in early February. Over 100 people filled the space. Business owners, scholarship recipients, community leaders, people whose lives Dad had touched in ways I was only beginning to understand. Uncle Hank and his family received invitations. I didn't expect them to come. But when I arrived, there they were, sitting in the back, looking uncomfortable but present. Even Aunt Deborah had shown up, though she wouldn't meet my eyes. Don Vito opened the event with a speech about community, family, and the quiet ways that good people improve the world around them. He talked about Dad's business acumen, his dedication to helping others, his belief that success meant nothing if it didn't improve people's lives. Then he did something I hadn't expected. He invited Uncle Hank to speak. My uncle stood slowly, walking to the microphone like a man approaching something he had been dreading. His face was pale, his hands gripping note cards that shook slightly. "I'm Hank Harper," he began, his voice uncertain. "Antonio Moretti's brother-in-law. And I owe everyone here an apology, but especially my niece, Ava." He glanced at me, then back at his notes. "For 25 years, I misjudged Antonio completely. I let prejudice and misunderstanding blind me to who he really was and what he was building. I called him a crook. I treated his family with disrespect. And at his funeral," his voice cracked slightly, "at his funeral, I said things that were cruel and completely wrong." The room was silent. Antonio Moretti was a successful businessman who built legitimate enterprises that employed hundreds of people and improved this community in ways I never bothered to see. He was generous, principled, and dedicated to helping people who had nowhere else to turn. And I was too arrogant to recognize any of that. He looked directly at me. "Ava, I'm sorry for the funeral. For every family gathering where I made you feel small. For every time I disrespected your father's memory. I was wrong about everything." It wasn't eloquent, and parts of it sounded rehearsed, but it was sincere and public. It was exactly what I'd asked for, justice by dignity. Afterward, people approached me with stories about Dad I'd never heard. A woman whose medical bills he'd paid when her insurance lapsed. A man whose small restaurant dad had helped save during the recession. A teenager who'd received a scholarship that made college possible when her family couldn't afford it. "Your father never wanted recognition," the teenager's mother told me, tears in her eyes. "He just wanted to help. That's the kind of person he was." I stood there, listening to story after story, realizing Dad had touched far more lives than I'd ever known. This gathering was showing me the full scope of his legacy, not just the businesses and properties, but the human impact of 25 years of quiet generosity. As people started leaving the event, Mom appeared at my elbow. "Can we talk?" she asked quietly. "Privately." We found a quiet corner in the restaurant. Mom, Sharon, looked smaller, somehow diminished in ways that had nothing to do with physical size. "I'm moving," she said without preamble, "to Oregon, to live near Jenna." The news shouldn't have surprised me, but it still landed with unexpected weight. "When?" "End of the month. I've already started packing." She twisted her hands in her lap. "I can't stay here anymore, Ava. Everywhere I look, I'm reminded of Antonio and what I failed to do. What I failed to be." "Mom," I started, but she interrupted. "I let my family treat him like garbage for 25 years. I stood silent at his funeral while they mocked him. I chose their approval over his dignity and your well-being. I don't know how to live with that." Her voice broke. "Can you forgive me?" "Someday. I'm not asking for now. I know I don't deserve it now, but maybe someday." I thought about all the years of silence, all the moments she could have stood up and chose not to. I thought about the funeral where she'd let them destroy us without saying a word. "I don't know," I said honestly. "Forgiveness isn't something I can force. But I understand you did what you thought you had to do to survive. I wish you'd been stronger. I wish you'd chosen us. But I understand." She reached into her purse and pulled out an envelope, worn at the edges like it had been handled many times over the years. "Your father wrote this for you 10 years ago," she said. "He made me promise not to give it to you until you were older and ready to understand, I think." I think you're ready now." After she left, I sat alone in that quiet corner and opened the letter with shaking hands. "My dearest Ava, if you're reading this, I'm gone. I hope your mother had the wisdom to give this to you when the time was right. There are things I need you to know, things I couldn't say while I was alive without revealing truths I wanted to protect you from. I built an empire, yes. Accumulated wealth, created businesses, established connections. But none of it matters compared to the only thing I got completely right, being your father. By the time you read this, you'll probably know about my real family, about the Moretti organization, about the world I kept separate from you. I made that choice deliberately, not because I was ashamed of you or ashamed of that world, but because I wanted you to have choices I never had. Real strength isn't about power or money, Ava. It's about knowing who you are and what you stand for, even when the world tries to tell you different. It's about making choices based on principles rather than fear. It's about using whatever resources you have to make life better for people who can't do it themselves. If you choose to walk away from everything I built, I'll be proud of you. If you choose to embrace it and continue the work, I'll be proud of you. The choice is what matters, the freedom to decide your own path. Remember that dignity and patience are their own forms of strength. Remember that revenge is hollow, but justice is necessary. Remember that the measure of a person isn't what they accumulate, but what they give and who they protect. I love you more than all the money in all the world. You are my greatest achievement, my proudest legacy, my best self made real. Whatever you choose, whatever you become, know that I'm proud of you. With all my love, Dad, Marcus. I cried in that quiet corner of the restaurant, finally grieving properly without anger or revenge or plans clouding the loss. Just pure grief for the man who'd loved me unconditionally and built an empire to protect me while teaching me to be strong enough not to need it. The months that followed were full of learning and building. Victor continued my education in both legitimate business operations and the more complex aspects of family obligations. I established the Antonio Marcus Moretti Foundation, expanding the scholarship programs and community assistance initiatives Dad had funded quietly for years. Skylar actually followed through on her promise to change. I secured her a job at one of the Harbor Grill restaurants as an assistant manager, working under Isabella, who had no patience for performance or laziness. Skylar worked harder than I'd expected. Early mornings, late nights, learning the business from the ground up. She's got potential, Isabella told me after 3 months. If she stays humble and keeps working, she might actually build something real. Our relationship wasn't warm, probably never would be, but there was mutual respect developing, built on honest work rather than family obligation. Aunt Jenna became an unexpected mentor, calling weekly to check in and offer wisdom about navigating family complexity. The best revenge, she told me one evening, isn't destroying people who hurt you. It's building something so good that their absence from it becomes their punishment. I thought about that often. Deborah and Hank were largely out of my life now, dealing with their own self-inflicted problems, while I built something meaningful with the resources Dad left me. A year after Dad's death, I sat in Don Vito's study, reviewing quarterly reports and discussing family business. He listened to my ideas about moving more operations into strictly legitimate territory, expanding community programs, making the Moretti name synonymous with community investment rather than just power and influence. "You have your father's strategic mind," he observed, pouring us both whiskey, "but your own moral compass. You question things Antonio accepted automatically. That's not weakness, Ava. That's evolution. The family has to change with each generation. or it becomes brittle and breaks. Your father built the foundation that allows you to even consider the path you're proposing. As I drove home through the city, I now understood in ways I couldn't have imagined a year ago. I thought about the girl who'd stood at her father's funeral in discount store shoes, being mocked by people who didn't know who she was. That girl was gone, not destroyed, but transformed. I had learned that revenge could be about revelation rather than destruction. That power was most effective when applied with precision rather than fury. That dignity and patience were their own forms of strength. I was Ava Moretti, daughter of Antonio Marcus Moretti, heir to his empire and his values, building a legacy that honored his name while creating my own path forward. My father's greatest gift wasn't the $42 million he left me. It was teaching me, through his example, that true strength meant knowing who you are and what you stand for, even when the world tries to tell you different. If you're watching this, remember that your true worth is not determined by the approval of your critics, but by the quiet strength of your character and integrity of your actions. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is let arrogance defeat itself. Choose dignity over drama and strategy over simple rage. That's the legacy worth building. If you had inherited $42 million and the power of a legacy, but could only use it to teach one lesson to the people who hurt you, what lesson would you choose? Justice, humility, or forgiveness? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for joining me on this journey. I appreciate you.